Welcome, everybody. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you might be. It's a great pleasure for me to both moderate and participate in this session, which is on WTO reform and why it is still a work in progress. We're going to organize a bit differently from a traditional kind of panel. So we're not going to have me moderating and people speaking. I'll also participate in the discussion. The way we structured this session is that Bob Wolf is going to kick off with a summary presentation on a paper that we have recently written that deals with this question. Then we'll have a discussion. We have two discussants who I'll introduce later, and then we can open it up for Q&A back and forth. And I guess we all know the drill. So to ask questions, use the chat feature. And I think at the end, if you want to participate, I guess you can also raise your hand and ask your question directly. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Professor Robert Wolf, who is a professor at Queen's University, Canada, and who has been working on the WTO probably for longer than he wants to admit. Bob.
Thank you, Bernard, and thank you everybody for joining us. I'm just waiting now for the slides to come up from David, I guess. There we go. So why is WTO reform still a work in progress? Well, you've probably all heard the old joke that an ambassador is an honest man sent to lie abroad for the Commonwealth. Sir Henry Wotton, who made that quip, merely meant that ambassadors reside abroad, not that they speak falsely. But ambassadors are not actually just a transmission belt for the views of capitals. They often have their own views, or they react to local context. Scholars, the normal approach is to look for gaps in how officials execute the wishes of politicians. That's the principal agent approach to looking at how the world works. We're doing something else. We want to know if there are gaps between ambassadors and capitals, that is, gaps within the state, as it were. And we did that with a survey of trade policy practitioners that I'll talk about in a moment. In our analysis of that survey, we had two questions. Are Geneva delegates, that is the officials sent from a capital to be in Geneva at the WTO, are they aligned with their capitals on priorities for the WTO? And second, is there any difference between officials representing OECD countries and non-OECD countries? That is, do they have different priorities? Well, the usual presumption would be that delegates represent national interests. That's what you would assume. And that's true, but not exactly. And that's because the environment that officials in Geneva work in is different from the environment that is faced by officials in capitals. So at home, the people in the trade ministry have to work with officials in the finance ministry, industry representatives are lobbying them all the time, civil society is trying to express a view, so they have one perspective on trade policy. In Geneva, oh, there's a typo there, that should be 163 other members affect how ambassadors see the world. And of course, they're affected by Geneva diplomatic practices. So you get a version of Miles' Law. Miles' Law, formulated in the context of bureaucracy in Washington, said that where you stand depends on where you sit. In the case of Geneva, perhaps your views on WTO priorities may well be influenced by where you sit. So the first possibility in our analysis, is there a Geneva effect? That is, in that social context of Geneva and interacting with all those other ambassadors, do officials respond differently than colleagues who might otherwise be quite similar in education and experience, and how those colleagues would view WTO issues? The Geneva effect, as we call it, may well result in greater priority on addressing particular issues or lesser priority on addressing issues. And you may get a degree of non-alignment between Geneva and the capitals, and you may get that first because Geneva might have more information than capitals on particularly organizational matters. They live with them, they know more about them. And they may also have differences in their assessment on what's feasible. Because they're talking to other ambassadors, they have a sense of what the negotiating traffic will bear. The second possibility in our analysis is, with respect to Geneva-based officials, is their priorities may differ from each other, as well as from capitals. And those Geneva officials may differ in the degree of the divergence in their views from the views of their colleagues in capitals. If there is that variance, it might reflect differences, first in the bureaucratic capacity of capitals, that is their ability to understand the issues, to send instructions to Geneva. And kind of a consequence from that, missions may differ in the amount of autonomy they've been given by their capitals to take positions on given issues. To test this second possibility, we used membership in the OECD because it's a very useful proxy for the North-South or developing country characterizations with which everybody is familiar, but in many respects, it's actually more precise. It tracks to some extent bureaucratic capacity in capitals, and it also tracks to some extent the degree of autonomy given to delegates in Geneva. Why would it do this? Well, OECD members tend to be high-income countries. They have sophisticated bureaucracies. They have trade policy capacity in capitals, which means they can send instructions to Geneva. OECD countries are like-minded, and both in the OECD and in other multilateral contexts, they work together a lot to assess economic policies, to think about what constitutes good practice. And so you might expect that there would be perhaps a greater degree of commonality in OECD countries, both in capitals and in Geneva. So our data comes from an online survey that we conducted in June 2020. It was anonymous, and every mission accredited to the WTO received the questionnaire, and we followed up to try to make sure we had a good response rate. The results that we got, and we have to stress this, we have to remind ourselves of this as we do the analysis, but it's really important. All we have is the individual views of the people who responded, and all they're telling us about is the relative priority they assign to an issue. That means there's nothing in our survey data and nothing in the results we present that can tell us anything about the desired outcomes of their governments. You could have two officials who have assigned the same priority to dealing with the issue, and they may have opposite responses on what they hope the outcome would be. We're simply looking at priorities. When we think about WTO reform, it's always important to remember that there are two dimensions to it, and we picked those up in the questions we asked in the survey and in how we analyze those responses. There's an institutional dimension, we call that fixing the machine, all the things in Geneva that may not work very well. And then there's the need to update the rules of the WTO because the world economy has changed rather a great deal since 1995. So I won't take you through all the elements of our questionnaire. These are the 16 questions that we analyze in this study. One of them on institutional matters is improving compliance with notification obligations. Another one is providing support for plurilateral agreements. That's simply the priority of making sure those work very well. Making the appellate body operational again would be high on anybody's list of what needs reforming in the WTO. Concluding ongoing negotiations on fisheries, subsidies, and agricultural support, obviously both a major issue on the substantive side of updating the rule book. And we had two sustainable development questions, which I'll highlight in what follows because it's part of the theme for the overall hub this week. We sorted the responses from our participants in two different ways. First, the first sort was whether respondents work in Geneva or in capitals. We had 66 responses from Geneva officials, 146 from capital-based officials. And then we sort by whether the officials represent OECD countries or non-OECD countries. And there we have an even split in the responses that we got. So our first hypothesis, H1, as we call it in the paper, if there is a Geneva effect, then Miles' law would affect all trade officials. And what we would expect to see is significant differences between Geneva and capitals in the importance that is accorded both to institutional and to policy issues. So we'll be reporting the results in these figures. The responses to the question were on a 5-point scale. The list of topics there on the left responds to those questions that I showed you just a moment ago. In the figures that follow, the order will vary because of the questions, because we're sorting to show the degree of alignment. I'm not going to try to explain the discrete choice regression analysis that was conducted. Very fancy work by Matteo Fiorini, who was helping us in the earlier stages of this work. The estimates that you see indicate whether belonging to a given group, that is OECD or non-OECD, is associated with less or more utility being assigned to the issue relative to the comparator group. In this slide, so the vertical line is at 0, and point estimates to the right show higher utility for delegates in Geneva on this scale. Point estimates to the left would show lower utility for officials in Geneva. If the difference from the 0 line is less than 0.1, we consider the two sets of respondents are pretty closely aligned. So looking more closely at that slide, you see there's a handful of issues that are on the pretty close to the red line. This is capitals on the left, Geneva on the right. And what we find is, you might think what we would have expected, capitals and Geneva are not often very much aligned. In particular, they're not aligned on the priority to be accorded to the issue of climate change or to the SDGs. They're also not accorded, but it's on the other side of the red line, to the priority to be accorded to fisheries and agriculture. So is there a Geneva effect? Well, maybe. There's obviously some degree of non-alignment of Geneva on capitals on most of the issues that we reported in that figure. And so you would expect there's some support for each one. But if we're going to make a robust inference, if we're going to be really confident that there's a Geneva effect, then you would expect that OECD officials representing OECD countries and non-OECD countries would have similar degrees, both of alignment with each other and of non-alignment with capitals. Well, that's not what we find. So the second hypothesis in our data that we advanced is that bureaucratic capacity and the constraints on bureaucratic capacity lead to greater autonomy for Geneva officials representing non-OECD countries than those representing OECD countries. And the expectation there would be that non-OECD officials in Geneva would diverge more from their own capitals than officials representing OECD countries would diverge from their capitals. And what we find is that OECD and non-OECD are not aligned. Their priorities are often far from the 0 line. On the left, what you see is the response from officials in capitals, where OECD capitals are on the right, non-OECD capitals are on the left, and there's only a couple of issues that are anywhere near the 0 line. On most issues, oddly enough, the non-OECD capitals on the left have a higher priority than OECD capitals. On the right, we look at Geneva, and there too, remember, it's a different ordering of questions because we're ordering them by the relative priority they accord to those issues. There's a small number of issues that are close to the 0 line, including, interestingly, work on the SDGs. So OECD and non-OECD in Geneva agree on that, but they don't agree on much else. There are wide divergences. Interestingly enough, they are very far apart. On climate change, OECD is on the right, a very high priority for OECD officials in Geneva relative to non-OECD officials. This degree of non-alignment is a lot more acute when we look at more directly at delegations. So on the left, this is capital versus Geneva for OECD countries. Geneva is to the right of the red line, and you see that most issues are a higher priority for Geneva than for capitals, especially dealing with fisheries and agriculture. But there's a lot of issues that are not, that are either we would consider aligned or close to aligned in the center. When you look on the right, the figure on the right, that's capital versus Geneva for non-OECD countries, Geneva to the right of the red line. And there's only 3 issues that are a higher priority in Geneva than in capitals. And on many issues, the views of people in non-OECD capitals are far from the red line. So there's really a big divergence between OECD and non-OECD countries. So maybe one could argue there is a Geneva effect, but only for non-OECD countries. Just to highlight what I've been saying already about the issues for sustainable development governance, capitals, especially non-OECD capitals, think the links between trade and climate change and the links between trade and the SDGs are much more important than the links in Geneva. But non-OECD capitals attach higher priority to these two issues than OECD capitals. And in Geneva, while the two are aligned on the SDGs, climate change is a significantly higher priority for OECD delegations. There are gaps on a lot of other issues, dispute settlement, current negotiation issues, and plurilaterals. So here's a different way of presenting our data. In columns 1 and 2 on the left, so that's OECD and non-OECD countries in the two columns 1 and 2. And here we're comparing Geneva and capitals for those two groups of countries. Geneva to the right of the red line, capitals to the left of the red line. Point estimates to the right are higher priority for Geneva. Let's look at support for plurilaterals, where what we find is in OECD countries, that is a higher priority in Geneva than it is in capitals. And so then we look at columns 3 and 4. And here it's Geneva in column 3, capitals in column 4, OECD to the right of the red line. And what we see is that support for plurilaterals is a much higher priority for OECD delegations in Geneva than for non-OECD delegations. And so we see there's actually quite a big gap between OECD and non-OECD on support for plurilaterals. There's even less alignment on the dispute settlement issues. In the lower right, you could look at the views of capitals on dispute settlement reform, and OECD and non-OECD are actually just about aligned on that one. But look in column 2 on making the appellate body operational again. That is a high priority for Geneva-based delegates of non-OECD countries, much higher than it is for their capitals. So there's big gaps here on how officials see dispute settlement reform. As for negotiation issues, take fisheries and agriculture first. It's a bigger, much higher priority. It's the first arrow there up the top for Geneva-based delegates of OECD countries. Maybe they just want to get this issue dealt with and off the table. That doesn't mean they agree on what the outcome should be. If you look on the third line, in the third column at reform of industrial subsidies, in Geneva, OECD countries assign a much higher priority to this than non-OECD countries. Again, probably not a big surprise. So you could say that Miles' law is holding at least a little. Our first hypothesis, where trade officials stand, does indeed appear to be influenced by where they sit. There are significant differences between Geneva and capitals in the priority accorded to addressing WTO issues, but delegates in Geneva representing OECD countries and non-OECD countries are clearly not on the same page. So take our second hypothesis. Bureaucratic capacity in capitals, interaction in other fora may condition autonomy for Geneva. For example, OECD countries meet at the OECD on a lot of issues, and so they may come to share certain views. They have sophisticated people in the capital. And what we see is there is indeed more alignment between Geneva and capitals in OECD countries. And there are greater differences between non-OECD capitals and Geneva in the perceived priorities of handling particular issues. So why is WTO reform so hard? Well, first off, delegates in Geneva are simply not on the same page as capitals. Sometimes ambassadors may be an obstacle, but other times the problem isn't capitals, but they're not on the same page. This Geneva effect, if we could call it that, is clearly more serious for officials of non-OECD countries, their gap with their own capitals. But officials of OECD and non-OECD countries are equally not on the same page. They're not on the same page in Geneva, quite clearly on some big issues. There are different priorities. And that may reflect instructions they're getting from capitals because their capitals are not on the same page on those issues. And so again, remember, we're talking about priorities, not whatever outcome somebody might prefer on these issues. These differences in the priorities that are according to issues could lead to fragmented negotiating effort. That is, some countries think that the effort, all the talk should be about fisheries subsidies. Somebody else might be thinking that the most important issue to be talking about is industrial subsidies. And so which meeting do you attend? What emphasis do you place on potential bargains? Equally, if your priorities are different, a potential outcome, a potential compromise on one issue may not interest you as much as a potential compromise on something else. And so feasible compromises get left on the table. If you're interested in the underlying work, we published a paper earlier this year with all the people who helped design the survey on the overall results from the over 800 people who responded. And there is a working paper that Bernard and I have recently put out on the official responses. And I think Bernard may have put the links to that in the chat. So thank you very much, Bernard. I'll stop there.
Great, thanks for that. Yeah, as mentioned by Bob, so the links to the papers are in the chat. We have two discussants before we open it up to Q&A. So the first discussant is going to be Alice Tipping, who is with our host, IISD, and was formerly with ICTSD. And I think most relevant, I think, for us right now in terms of the paper, used to be an advisor to the New Zealand government and is someone who has been in Geneva and has certainly seen and been part of this machinery for a long time. Our second discussant is going to be Mercedes Aros, who is a former vice president, a former minister of trade, a former minister of the economy. I'm not going to go through the long list, but is currently a professor at the Universidad del Pacífico. And I think, Mercedes, I'm really curious to see what you're going to say, because obviously as a former minister and as somebody who has been in the trenches, you'll have a perspective both from capitals. So I think we have both Geneva and capitals to some extent represented here as discussants. So we'll start with Alice. Alice?
Thank you very much indeed, Bernard, and thank you very much, Robert, to both of you for inviting me to comment on this fascinating paper. I should say, really, I read it from the perspective of a practitioner, not as an academic. I was only ever a very poor one. So yes, I worked as a New Zealand diplomat and as a researcher and policy advisor for a number of years in Geneva, and the occasional frequent disconnect between Geneva and capitals is fascinating. And I think this is an extremely useful piece of study, and I hope that there's future pieces of study that come after it to address perhaps some questions around outcomes, which I'll get to in a minute. So I wanted to comment on a couple of the key findings that I thought were really interesting. The idea that there isn't a generalized Geneva effect, but that there might be a Geneva effect limited to a couple of issues, fisheries and agriculture. And I suspect the reasons for this that the paper suggests are probably right, particularly for fisheries and particularly for agriculture. This idea that capital-based officials are closer to domestic politics of their fishers, of their farmers, closer to domestic, sort of the desires of ministers to stay in office and keep their constituents happy, and officials' desire to keep their own jobs, right? The closer you are to the sun, the more attention you get, but the easier it is to get burned if you make the wrong policy decision. So there's a natural sensitivity, of course, of being in capital. And to be very honest, I've lived in the Geneva bubble for many years, and it can feel very disconnected from local politics anywhere. So I think that's the additional kind of political sensitivity to domestic politics of capital officials is an obvious reason. So why is it that Geneva diplomats are particularly forward-leaning or prioritize some key issues? I think there is a sort of a socialization effect, as the paper suggests. Sitting in these rooms for hours and hours, you can't help but be influenced by the views and the perspectives that you hear that are very different from your own, if you're a relatively open-minded person. And it's bred from exactly spending lots of time in the same room as your colleagues, engaged sort of in a common endeavor, socializing with them, making friends with them. There is a Geneva community that develops, and you do begin to appreciate perspectives other than just what you were brought up with as a very junior policy advisor, for example. So there's partly the sort of socialization effect, and it is, I think, as the paper suggests, also an assessment of what is feasible, right, which is sort of one of the crucial jobs of being a Geneva diplomat. I think, as the paper suggests, it's about reading the room to get a sense of not just what is said, and that's recorded in the minutes, but how something is said, the tenor, the tone of the conversation, which suggests to you how strongly a position is held or whether there might be flexibility. And I can't really say that without stopping for a couple of points to recognize how much and how little these effects have changed with the pandemic, right? So firstly, capitals are increasingly now in the negotiating room, if time zones and internet connections permit. So they can read the room themselves now, more or less. But at the same time, they aren't in the hallways. They're not in the coffee bar by the WTO atrium, where important discussions and clarifications can happen. So being here in Geneva in the moment still matters. And as a delegate said to me when we were discussing the possibilities for advancing the fisheries negotiations in a virtual mode, she said to me, you know, there are things you just can't communicate if you're not in person, which for me was a really interesting insight and a reminder, I suppose, of the very human interpersonal skills involved in being a diplomat. So there is all of that, I think, are good reasons for why the Geneva Effect probably exists, at least with some specific topics, right, where a lot of attention, a lot of hours have been focused. And also why there is the possibility, at least, of there being a Geneva Effect on some issues, despite the fact that capitals can now sit in the room and read it themselves. So, you know, why is it specifically fish? Why is it specifically ag? I was sort of trying to think about this, and it instinctively made sense, right? That these would be two issues on which Geneva delegates might assign a similar sort of level of priority. Why is it? And I think it's because agriculture is often sort of talked about in the Geneva context as the engine of multilateral negotiations, right? Throughout the Doha round, if agriculture wasn't moving, nothing else was moving, right? So it is still kind of seen as being one of the key negotiations, and if that moves, everything else moves. Why we all think that? Maybe that's part of the socialization process. And fisheries, of course, has been positioned as the litmus test for the WTO in its response to new environmental and sustainable development questions, right? And has emerged, interestingly, as a standalone issue from the Doha round that can and should be resolved on its own merits. So I can sort of understand from my experience as a practitioner why those two issues might attract a Geneva Effect when others might not. And then the other interesting point I thought, interesting finding, of course, the idea that OECD capitals and Geneva delegates are relatively more aligned than non-OECD capitals and non-OECD delegates. And I suspect the argument that lesser capacity means more autonomy in Geneva is probably true to a degree, right? It takes a lot of investment in training somebody in the law and practice and technicalities of operating in the WTO. That's a lot of investment in one person. So if they're posted here, it only becomes natural that they're a source of advice for the government and that they have more autonomy, because there are a few other people in capital who have had that same investment made in them to enable them to work on these issues. So it's partly that, but I also wonder whether it could also be the result of longer postings for non-OECD members. Many delegates from non-OECD countries will stay in Geneva for 5 years or sometimes decades representing their country, right? So they perforce are much more likely to have their views formed by living, in some cases for a very long time, in the Geneva bubble. Whereas OECD delegates, I in my experience, will tend to rotate much faster. So maybe that's part of it. So if non-OECD delegates have more autonomy and perhaps are less influenced by capitals, then who are they influenced by? And I was really interested to see there isn't much evidence of non-OECD delegates' perspectives aligning with those of NGO respondents in Geneva, right? Because this was sort of one of the sub-hypotheses. And as an NGO who's trying to influence some of these people, I looked for this in the paper. You know, and so it's really interesting, right, that despite the sort of anecdotal evidence and despite the assumption that all of these NGOs like mine kind of working to help influence perspectives, that there wasn't a lot of alignment there. And I was particularly interested to see that that at least if I read the graphs correctly, that it was slightly odd to see NGOs on average assigning less priority to the negotiations on fisheries and agriculture than the non-OECD respondents. That probably suggests that I didn't fill the survey out, because I would have hoped that I would have added one more response that would have pulled that average up. So maybe that's my own fault. But despite that, the other kind of NGO-focused finding I thought was really interesting was that there was more interest from non-OECD Geneva delegates in having stakeholders engaged in the thematic discussions, right? And I've heard this, in fact, from a number of delegates already. There is an interest in having independent, objective input on the issues at hand, right? Not just the data that their OECD counterparts can present, which presents the OECD governments in their best possible light. So it was interesting to see that sort of divergence, right? That there wasn't a lot of immediate alignment between NGO priorities in Geneva and the non-OECD delegates, but that there was a demand for this input, right? There was a demand for data that could turn to influence and could turn to more alignment. So I thought that was interesting. And then you rightly reminded us all at the beginning, Bob, that what the survey results speak to is an ordering of priorities, and it doesn't speak to the question of desired outcomes. And I confess, as a practitioner, that is immediately where my mind starts to go. And perhaps that's the next question that another paper, another set of surveys might explore. Does the Geneva Effect lead to a narrowing or a widening of gaps between perspectives on desired outcomes? And I suppose maybe I'm being too political about things, but the issue that I kept glimpsing through the evidence is the fact of the politicization of discussion in the WTO. In other words, the idea that the Geneva Effect brings delegates' senses of priority closer together, but actually also works to push apart what they see as their desired outcomes on a particular priority, perhaps even distancing delegates' views of what is acceptable in Geneva from what might be acceptable in capitals. And I remember, one of the fears I heard in the corridors in advance of MT12, which is meant to be now, was what will ministers make of some of the brackets left in these texts? There was a real fear that ministers would come in and say, why haven't you been able to agree to this issue? This is a technical issue, don't bring this to me, right? This sort of realization that positions had become entrenched in Geneva to the extent that decisions that really should be made at the Geneva level hadn't been made and were being kicked back to ministers in the hopes that capitals would be more flexible than Geneva had been able to be. This is all about outcomes, I realize, and not priorities. But I suppose the question that I keep coming back to, and I suppose what worries me, is that delegates from both developed and developing countries find their perspectives of priorities and of outcomes slightly warped by the politics of the WTO negotiating room, right? That developed country delegates might support issues and hold fast to desired outcomes even more than their capitals, and that developing country delegates might, in fact, both of them in both directions, would reject prioritizing issues and hold fast to outcomes less ambitious than their capitals might support. And I think there were two other points in the paper that could be developed in an outcomes direction if there was more work to be done. And the first is the point about groups defining positions. And I think it's an extremely important area of research that people like Amrita Nalikar have done a lot of work on, but bears more scrutiny. And it's clear that coalitions are key to the effective engagement of a lot of small WTO members. They're a huge source of strength, but with that strength comes inevitably internal trade-offs of interests and often considerable inflexibility in negotiating positions, right? And I think some members find it can be a bit of a Faustian bargain if membership of a group forces different prioritization of issues than national economic interest would dictate. It won't happen for everyone, but I know it does happen for some. So that would be an interesting thing to look a bit more at. And the other thing that struck me, in fact, was the JSIs, and it's come up already once, but the idea that OECD, if I read the paper correctly, and correct me if I haven't, that OECD delegates are sort of out in front of their capitals on the importance of the JSIs, and non-OECD delegates are a bit behind their capitals on the importance of this issue. And I think the paper suggests it's significant opposition that's emerged to the JSIs that may help to explain why capitals aren't aligned on the priority given to them. But I wonder if that opposition actually explains why non-OECD Geneva delegates are less aligned with their capitals on the issue, right? That being in Geneva makes them less likely to prioritize somebody else's issue because it's seen as somebody else's agenda. And in fact, this reminds me of a conversation I was party to recently where a developed country delegate was asked what WTO reform should look like. And they replied, yes, of course, well, it should be the JSIs. So no mention of anyone else's priorities, no mention of JSIs along with something else. And I think this is and I'd be interested to hear whether the authors of the paper think this as well. But the risk here is that sort of extreme attachment to just your issues is going to make it more difficult to get to multilateral solutions, not just on your issues, but at all. And I've already spoken for too long, but I hope that's been some thought-provoking additions to the analysis. Thanks.
Many thanks, Alice. Indeed, that was very useful for us, and I think also very interesting. So we'll come back to that. So we'll now give the floor to Mercedes.
Thank you, Bernard and Robert, and congratulations on a very interesting paper that opens many other questions that can be followed. And I agree with Alice with their comments, because I think they're quite interesting from the point of view, as she said, of a practitioner. I'm going to be talking as a practitioner in capital, but that's the other side of the story. And also in terms of what I'm trying to do right now as a professor of economics, I'm trying to introduce this idea of the institutional economics on political transaction cost, which is quite interesting, and well, one of the main economists. I really admire the work that he did several years ago on the political environment, things to the policy of policies. I mean, well, it's the politics of policy, the policy making. And here we're having the same thing, this transaction cost that comes in because we have the same problems that we in industrial organization of principal agent, coordination failures, and many others kinds of failures that cannot be addressed directly because we are having this kind of differences, which are market failures but can be translated to the political market too, in this case for the WTO. And I find the paper quite good in pinpointing the issue of principal agent. Who is the principal? Who is the agent? In this case, the agents are basically in Geneva. The principal should be in capital, but sometimes that conversation do not occur as fast and as good as it should. Why? Because it's in particular for developing countries. You have this divorce because all the problems that you have locally, that you have to focus locally in the country with the demands, your own principles as an agent, as a ministry is being the agency, the agents of the citizens are there, you know, so you have to focus on that. And then the main issues that if you don't have a clear map of what's going on in WTO are far away. Second, the people that are in Geneva usually are for the foreign trade, not from the foreign trade ministry or the finance minister, that probably will be focused on the issues that are related to the policies discussed in WTO. Usually are coming from the foreign affairs minister. And these people are probably more connected to, because these delegates probably are delegates not only to WTO, but all the UN institutions that are sitting there in Geneva. So they are represented more issues, more political issues, and they have to balance, and probably their priorities are somewhere else, more related with these UN issues that WTO itself. So WTO is one of the issues that are addressing, among others, and that makes things difficult. And of course, as Alice mentioned, relations there are important. Once they talk with their counterparts, they are trying to address issues that are more common in the place. They know what is going on, and they have to conceal ideas, for example, with their Latin American groups, the coalitions, or with the coalitions on G20 or Cairns or G33. And that's very difficult. I remember when I was Minister of Trade, we made a decision, a political decision coming from a Foreign Affairs Ministry, saying we have to get with G20 because Brazil was leading G20 and we have to support Brazil, which was like very important for our geopolitical relations. As a Minister of Trade, I said G20 is going in the other direction. I don't want to be there. And I said to the president, okay, I go to G20, but let me get into Cairns. I want to be with the group of Cairns too. So these coalitions can be, I mean, at least from capital, we decided to have some balance and make sure that the foreign affairs interests wouldn't damage our trade industries in that moment. So that was like an issue that we have to address. So coalitions are very important, very important. I think we have to focus on that. Sometimes who is the leader or the main voice, the country that may have the main voice can damage your own interests, even that you're for many other political reasons. So we have to be careful with how we manage the relations with these coalitions. For example, being in G33 for us was like going against what we had at that moment as our main trade policy. We went to the meetings, but this was like, we were saying, what are we doing here when we don't have the alignment of interests as countries, you know? And well, but there was this political interest from foreign affairs not to damage our relationship with them. So this is the game that we have to play. Also, it's interesting because sometimes what Alice mentioned is important. Representatives in Geneva have a career there, and the relationships they make are also important for them for the future, because after they finish their representation over there, probably they will have to find a job or follow up in some place together with the same group. So the coalition of interests are there. The interests will move in that direction, and it's totally normal. We understand that they have the flavor of what's going on, where are the major issues that are important for them. So they will follow more or less what is called keep up with the Jones, you know, they will keep up with the Jones, with the rest, to address the same issue. So this is an issue that should be understand to work with them. The issue of these differences between OECD and non-OECD countries, for me, it's quite clear. Usually, if Peru wanted to be part of OECD until very recently, we were applying, you know. So we have to focus and transform ourselves to be alienated with them in terms of the regulatory acquis, for calling in some ways, all the previous history. So you probably would have all the same policies altogether, more or less the same policy altogether, and follow some views. You have the like-minded view. So you probably go into the committees that they have there in Paris, working with them on many issues, will address the policies in the same way. So in terms of trade policy, it's more likely that you follow that. And I will add that an additional issue. Countries that have more trade agreements, free trade agreements with countries like Europe or US and other that are into WTO, I mean in OECD, our country is one of that, probably will follow these more open market views that are addressed by OECD. So probably that will be an additional point to address, how countries that have more free trade agreements with them will have some follow of the same agenda in terms of capitals and also in terms of the Geneva groups. So I understand perfectly that your hypothesis could show with the data what is going on in that sense. What I find interesting is how other countries are influenced by NGOs, and I would like to see more details on that, because usually the building of the new agenda, I mean, the new agenda is more interconnected than before, you know, so these issues are for many countries like us an issue that we have to follow with more detail. All these SDGs that are so important, and we have to address like climate change or labor issues, social issues are very, an issue that is now touching not only the governments, but also touching the interests of firms. So probably it's transforming our position of how we address negotiations in WTO, because even the banks are asking some of these compliances of environmental, social, and governance issues when they are asking, firms are asking for loans or things like that. So these issues will be the new agenda, and probably it's interesting to see how that is working. So there's a lot of other things I would like to mention, and for example, the issue of not having hierarchy, the hierarchic way that WTO is not there as much as it's in other international organizations and as the World Bank or IMF. So this is a way of reducing transaction costs, the hierarchical building of these institutions, but how we can change that in WTO when we want to have this consensus building in the process of generating agreements. So that's a difficult way to internalize for us, but I think the better way to internalize probably will be the idea of having these coalitions, with these measures of balance that we probably have to build on, or maybe another way of internalizing will be the introduction of the support of NGOs in addressing trade policies together with the issues that we are talking on around the United Nations agenda, for example. So that's some ideas I have on the paper, but I really enjoy it. I feel this is a very interesting way to address the problems that we have to build the reform of WTO that is so big in terms of as a word, but I think that the paper addresses it in the right way with a simple and process of analysis, but very fine-tuned. So I really enjoyed the paper. I think it's a very interesting point for us as researchers also to work together. Thank you, and thank you very much.
Great, thanks to you for all of those comments and remarks. So let me just reflect a little bit on the points that were made before we before we open it up to Q&A. And maybe Bob also wants to come in, depending on how much Q&A, how many questions there are. I think one thing I wanted to, so obviously we were a bit frustrated in terms of, so a lot of the questions you've posed are questions we've posed ourselves and say, wouldn't it be great if we could actually do the analysis and kind of get to grips to that? And basically that goes down to, you know, the survey, it goes down to the sampling frame, it gets down to response rates, right? So to some of the things that both of you were asking in terms of, you know, what's the role of NGOs in terms of what's the alignment between what different NGOs see in terms of, even if we just limit this to priorities. So different types of NGOs, whether they're issue specific, whether they're more development, sustainability oriented. So what's the alignment between respondents from those groups with, the officials that we were targeting? And I think the problem is, and the second paper I circulated, which is the one just on the survey itself. So overall, in terms of the survey, we had around 800 respondents. So actually we had a very high number of respondents to the survey. But then if you look at who responds to this, it's mostly people like us, that is academics. So, okay, it's great to know what academics think, but it's not really what we're interested in, particularly, unless we can identify academics with giving advice, being part of the machine. So that's a challenge. And I think what it points to, so what we hope is that this type of work might incentivize the Secretariat or others to actually do this in a more systematic and more consistent way, also over time, right? Because this is also, of course, a dynamic issue. So if we could kind of get the response rates up, if we could actually do more to also include questions of the type that we actually should have included but didn't because we didn't think about it when we designed the survey, which has to do with the incentives of the people who are actually responding, right? And both of you made that point in terms of where is your career, how long are you in Geneva, where are you coming from as an official, where do you expect to go as an official? And again, these are all things which I think are really important in getting a better answer to our question. But I think it's also important just to understand what might be driving some of the things we're observing in the data. So again, we've certainly also for ourselves said, well, this is maybe something we should be doing down the road because there's a lot of kind of related literature that we weren't really thinking about when we started to write the paper, which has to do on the role of the Secretariat, which has to do with, again, these career incentives, which would be really interesting to get a handle on, and which we weren't able to. So that's one thing I wanted to mention. On the NGO, so one of the things we did in terms of the original survey, we can identify people who come from international organizations, we can identify people who are associated with NGOs, but that's really something that we needed to do much better in the sense to identify types of NGOs, to identify the IOs. And again, this is something where the response rate has to be pretty high in order to differentiate between different types of organizations, identify, I think we identified WTO Secretariat, I'm not sure, but there's also sensitivities, obviously, in terms of the whether staff are permitted to participate in these types of surveys as well. So again, that's something to worry about. But that's certainly something that we have on the list of things to do. I think Alice's points on whether there is a Geneva effect in terms of reducing the range of possible outcomes. And if we have a smaller range of possible outcomes, but they're more divergent, then that actually having implications for the probability of getting to yes. I think that's a very good point to make. And I think it is something where, again, you need to design the survey instrument to actually get at that. And we weren't able to do that. We weren't even thinking about it at the time because we were really, the whole survey was really designed around, okay, what are the most important sets of issues for you, right? Depending on where you're sitting. Coalitions, both of you mentioned coalitions. We had a long, we beat our head against the wall trying to kind of think about what we could say about coalitions given the data we have. And we concluded there isn't much we can do with the current survey, but that's again something where we can design surveys to do exactly this. But I think one of the interesting things that Mercedes was saying, which is an element, I think, of what might be lurking beneath these difference in priorities when you ask individual officials from countries, is, the point you made. Peru is in the G33. Why? Well, you explained why. But what it means in practice, that if you could actually unbundle the G33 and you find this huge heterogeneity, perhaps, in terms of where you actually want to go. So one, priority for the issue, but two, also the substance. You know, we might get a better sense of, okay, so do these coalitions actually help or hinder, right? And I think there, the point I think Alice was also making, in terms of putting more information on the table so that we can actually figure out, okay, so what is actually the implications of the position that is taken by a particular coalition on an issue for the members of that coalition, including, of course, also countries that are not part of that coalition. So these are all really interesting questions. And I think my bottom line would be, these are all things that we could be doing much more effectively to actually distill this information by using these types of survey instruments. And, you know, and I think the fact of the matter is other organizations use surveys a lot more than the WTO does, right? So I think that's the first kind of recommendation I think Bob and I would make to the management of the WTO, including the WTO members themselves. You know, it's actually in your own interest to have a much better sense of where people stand, right? And then, of course, for us, it's interesting to know whether that's a function of where they sit. But if we're really thinking about getting to solutions, getting more of that information on the table, I think is important. So we had business in the survey as well. And again, you see quite differences in terms of positions that are taken by people who are in the private sector as opposed to officials. But there again, we need a much higher kind of response rate. You need to do that by sector. So we couldn't do that here, but I think this is all kind of forward looking. It's all work that really should, and I think more importantly, can be done, right? None of this is rocket science. I mean, this is something we can actually do. And I think we definitely should be doing it. Okay. So I think you can raise your hand if you want to intervene. You can also use the chat. So we are open for questions, comments, suggestions. Let us know. And if nobody wants to intervene, then I'm going to give the floor to Bob, because I'm sure he has things to say about what he heard. So while Bob is speaking, if you feel, you know, so either use the chat or raise your hand. I think everybody is capable of raising their hands in Zoom. I mean, technically. Bob?
Well, let me first thank Mercedes and Alice for some wonderful comments that give us food for thought as we move on to another version of the underlying paper. And Bernard, of course, I agree with you that some of their suggestions could only be addressed in a better designed survey. As soon as we started looking at the data, we said, why did we put agriculture and fish in the same question? Those are different things. So we got a sense of priority for old issues there, but we got no sense of any difference between those two big issues. So that we could ask better questions if we did it again. And Bernard had lots of good points on how we could design a better survey. One of the things that would be interesting to do would be to have enough time and money to do targeted interviews, because I think it's only then that you can start teasing out the relationship between a response about priorities to the underlying outcome desired by a particular country. And I think some of the demographic information that one would like to have about where an official came from and where she thinks she's going, I think you need a survey might get that more easily and quickly from people who might not want to put that kind of information in writing. So there are ways you can do a better job on a survey. But probably the most important thing is to try to do more of this, because I think it does begin to help people who would like to get to an outcome to pinpoint where there might be obstacles, and therefore who you ought to be talking to. And so there could be some capitals where you really need to be saying to the minister, do you actually agree with what your ambassador in Geneva is saying, for example? And there's a cost there in MC12 not taking place. And there's a cost there in the pandemic ending up, meaning it's been 4 years since all ministers got together. and many ministers over the last 2 years have met each other only on Zoom, and that's not very good. So helping ministers meet each other, talk to each other, get some sense of each other's priorities clearly would make a difference for some of the reasons that Alice was mentioning. Bernard, we had one question in the chat early on from Johanna Lorenzo, and maybe you want to tackle it. She says, comparing the OECD and non-OECD Geneva officials, what could explain the difference between the group's willingness to engage with the trade sustainability, especially environmental nexus discussions at the WTO? Is it only the greater alignment of OECD Geneva officials to their capitals, or could it be because the Geneva/OECD position is starkly different from non-OECD capitals' priorities? I'll let you speculate on that one.
Sorry, I was muted. Yeah, there's also a question on have you surveyed the educational and ideological background of respondents to measure if they impact their approaches to issues. And I think that very much goes to the point of that we don't know much about, we don't know anything about the background of these officials, and that's really something for future work where we want to unpack. So we did have some questions in the original survey with respect to educational background, professional background. You know, are you a lawyer or are you an economist? So there is some of that in there, which we didn't use in the current paper. So we could potentially kind of get back to some of that, but we'd really want to do much more in terms of identifying what some of the correlates might be of positions that are taken by individuals. On the trade, sustainability, environmental nexus, I don't really have a good explanation for this. And I think, you know, so again, we asked about priorities. And I think one of the problems or challenges in terms of interpreting the results is that inevitably there's it's a probability that views of substance are going to influence your ranking of issues, right? But what really struck me from the survey more generally, and this is not necessarily an OECD, non-OECD distinction, but it's more that the trade people, and this was a survey addressed to trade people, were really not all that supportive of getting engaged in a discussion of how should trade policy help deal with climate change, right? It really was not rated particularly highly. Now, maybe that's partly a function of the time that the survey occurred, because clearly now it's rising steadily on the agenda, right? And it's obviously the theme for this whole event. But if you think about what the European Union is doing with the carbon border adjustment mechanism, if you think about the recent deal between the EU and the US on getting rid of these steel and aluminum tariffs that were imposed by the Trump administration, but doing so by really linking it to greening steel, if I can put it that way, that clearly suggests that at least we have two very large players in the WTO who are actively doing this or talking about it right now. So it could be time dependent. But the other thing that really struck me about the survey results is there was a question on should we trade community be doing more to look at the social effects of trade agreements, of what we're doing, impact analysis, and that got very, very little support, right? And to me, that is a symptom of a problem, which I think is quite an important one. And how we deal with this, I don't know, but I think there is a clear disconnect between and maybe this also goes back to the theme of the paper in terms of, does where you sit determine where you stand? I mean, there's a much broader meta dimension of this. If you're a trade person, does that affect how you stand on a lot of issues that for others, and in particular, other ministries or citizens, voters, are really much more salient, much more important. So that might point to a more bigger, meta type issue that we should be thinking more about as well. So let me stop there.
Bernard, if I could come back to something Alice said, very interesting comments about politicization and whether the Geneva effect was actually driving positions of some delegates farther apart. And that really needs a lot of thought. It's an interesting academic question, but it's a really important question for the Director General and the Chair of the General Council and for ambassadors generally. The line some of us have been using is that they're just talking past each other now, often, rather than talking to each other. And maybe that's a pandemic effect. Maybe they aren't having dinner enough or going to lunch enough, not being in the corridors enough. But there really is something going on there, I think, and it is not helpful for the ability of the organization to function or to reach negotiated outcomes.
Okay, so we have another question in the chat, which is, what influence does the fact that the WTO has to take decisions by consensus have on the Geneva effect? So Bob, you want to take that?
I'm not, does it have an influence on the Geneva effect? Well, yes, for the reasons that we outlined right off the top. In Geneva, you have to talk to other countries to try to figure out where there might be some zone of potential agreement to find out what's feasible, and consent, because you have to reach consensus. And capitals are freer to simply think what they would like it to see happen as opposed to what might be feasible in Geneva. So obviously there is some effect there, but it's maybe better to stop there than to go down the rabbit hole of all the different understandings of what consensus is and what it's doing. Although I should say that our question on plurilaterals might have been tapping into question to attitudes towards consensus, since it was OECD delegates in Geneva who were most interested in support for plurilaterals. And one of the reasons that countries got into plurilaterals was to try to get around the consensus obstacle. And we know there are many developing countries, maybe a lot of non-OECD countries, who are quite attached to consensus and a single undertaking. And so that question might have been tapping into that set of attitudes, but it wasn't well enough designed to get that.
Okay, we have around 5 minutes left. So why don't I go back to, in reverse order, Mercedes and then Alice, in terms of some final takeaways.
Thank you again, Robert and Werner, for their answers are fantastic also. I have a question, probably is thinking in the future of the role of the Secretariat, because I think the ability of the Secretariat will be to create this consensus building, which is so important, and will, for example, use these middle ground groups that we have, that they're not in the extreme positions, as instruments to create more value, for example, dispute settlement or fishery, for example, in which fishery, at least in my country, we have a lot of interest to have final agreement. So how we can help the Secretariat to really use, it's sad that you said, Robert, that ministers are not there talking, because that's when you have the possibility to create this kind of consensus. But at least working with the people that are there, we may have the ability to send the mandate more clearly. If we have the Director General talking with the ministers and pushing these ideas of having at least some kind of agreement on some these major issues of the fishery, which I think is very important for many of the developing countries. So I think, and also the environment. So we have to push these ideas with all our heart, but I think there's like a lack of this movement that I remember when Pascal Lamy was there. He was using a lot of these middle ground groups to push this idea. So I don't see that right now, and I wish to learn more. So this is my question: is there isn't a possibility? And I think consensus building is important for us, but the plurilateral sometimes helps a lot. We have developed some ideas on some of these joint statements that are in process right now, and I think are useful to create the push to the further reforms later on. So I think that's an idea that probably will be useful to create more value for WTO.
Thanks. So I know that Bob has actually done quite a bit of work on this, including on what you were talking about in terms of the use of bridge clubs to move things along. So maybe he can come back to that in his final remarks. Alice? You're muted, yeah.
Yes, I'm sorry. I was just moving, and I was moving the chat window so I could find my mute button. I mean, this has been a fascinating discussion, and I mean, I hope both you, Bernard, and Bob take, if I may, Mercedes and my comments very much as a kind of wholehearted appreciation for the work that's been done, and merely, this is brilliant. Could you also do our big long list of everything else that would be wonderful to find out about? So please don't interpret any of what we're saying as criticism of the work done or of the survey. There's so much more that we would love to know based on these methods about how our own community functions, frankly. And in terms of kind of what we do next, you know, I was thinking, as I was sort of thinking about this session, why is WTO reform so hard? Do you know, many of the answers and some really important perspectives on this question were actually given in the opening plenary of this hub. I don't know if those of you in North America may have not been able to join it because it was at 9 o'clock this morning. But have a look for the recording when it's up, because there were lots of really interesting perspectives given there about the sort of contending narratives of what trade policy is meant to be about, right? Which might explain, you know, I'm looking at the graphs again, why climate change is so important in non-OECD capitals, but seemingly so unimportant here. There was a lot of interesting material there that I think kind of brings to light some of the possible answers to this question. But one thing that Jos Pauline actually said, which really resonated with me, is that, you know, if you find, and I suppose this is my sort of my sub-thesis, if we find that the Geneva Effect is in fact making it more difficult for some countries to reach agreement because it tends to draw countries into trenches of what their ideology or their group or kind of their conception of their own identity as a negotiator leads them to want to look for, how do you get past that? And his point was, you have to bring evidence into the discussion. And this is why it is so important for everyone, right? OECD and non-OECD countries to have access to impartial, objective evidence that's not just kind of useful to know, but that actually is tailored to help them understand the negotiating issue that they're faced with. And this is a role for NGOs, absolutely. It's a role for academics, absolutely. And this is the sort of value that this paper brings, is helping everyone in the Geneva bubble to see a little bit more clearly what's really going on. But the other important role is not just understanding what's going on inside the bubble, but helping to actually burst the bubble, right? Helping the people sitting here and in the WTO to understand whether their position really makes sense, not just with respect to what their capital does or does not have time to send them, but with respect to what's happening in all sorts of other fora, right? So I think, you know, if as we see here, you know, climate change and SDGs and the social issues are important discussions, these are not discussions still trade policy experts are used to having. They're going to need help, fair enough, right? Most of them are lawyers and economists that have been versed in WTO law. They don't know about the ILO conventions and their relevance. So they will need a lot of, I think, kind of a supporting community to help modernize not only the agenda, but the nature of the discussion. And that I still think is our best way out of kind of the ideological trenches that are so easy to fall into when you're a trade negotiator. But thank you for the work. I think it's brilliant.
Thanks for that suggestion. Our universities are ready to help with the retraining. Bob, we're at the last minute, so you have the last word.
Well, Alice has given us more for a big agenda, as has Mercedes. I think let me simply end that the best thing you could do for WTO reform is end the pandemic, because with the pandemic order, people could start going to lunch again. Ministers could come to Geneva. People could start thinking about different ways to bridge their differences. Maybe you could have more and better thematic sessions to get more information into the knowledge set for delegates, and maybe there's room for WTO to start engaging with academics even more, so we can help with the knowledge base, right, Bernard? That's what we stand ready to help. So thank you.
Great. Yeah, so thanks again to both of you for acting as discussants and for giving us a lot of food for thought. I take the point of this not being criticism. We are much more critical amongst ourselves as to what we've been doing than the both of you were. There's still a lot of work to be done on this. Thanks again also for everybody who joined the call. There will be a recording of this. And again, I would encourage you to read the papers. They're both on the web. So hope to see you in person, not in the not too distant future. I've been saying that for a long time, but let's hope we're getting there. Bye-bye.